All right, let's look at these connectors. I think we could make them a little bit more interesting than just glowing white lines. I think if we added a little bit of a texture to it, it might be kind of cool. So let's come over to Add. I've got those connectors connected, or rather selected, and I have the node editor open here for those objects. Let's go to Texture, and let's add a Voronoi texture here. And let's go to Add and Shader, and let's add a Diffuse shader. And for that diffuse shader, I think I'll just make it black. And so then we'll also add another shader, and that shader will be a mix shader. Mix those two together. And so we're not going to use the Voronoi texture directly. What we're going to use is we're going to use it to decide which is going to be emission and which is going to be black diffuse. So I connect the two together, and then I drag the factor to the factor here. And you can see it's got some lines in it. And if we increase the scale, you can see what it's doing there. It's adding those lines to the texture itself. And that looks pretty nice. We could animate that during the animation, and those lines could change. And that might be make it a little bit more interesting. But anyway, that's just a nice way to have the connectors be a little bit more interesting than just glowing white lines. We could do something similar to the molecule atoms. So right now we just have a mix between glossy, a perfect mix between glossy and this diffuse green. And we could do something similar. Let's go to Add, Texture. Let's try a noise texture. And let's drag the factor to the factor here. And so that'll control, let's turn up the scale. And that'll turn, and noise is more of like it's more of a knobby sort of color. You can sort of see it right there. You can turn up the detail and you might be able to see it a little bit better. Let's turn that up to 10. And so you can start to see it a little bit right there and right there. So it just gives it a little bit more texture, a little bit more interesting. And we'll talk about using micro displacement textures in another assignment. I think that might be a little bit too much for what we're trying to do right now. Let's do the same thing for this one. So I've got glossy and blue, or glossy white and diffuse blue right here. So if I go to Add, Texture, let's try magic texture this time, and plug the factor into the factor here. We'll see what that looks like if we get up close to it. If we make the rough on the glossy a little bit even rougher, it'll spread out that color more, and you'll see that magic texture in more detail. You can see it right there. You can increase the distortion. Sometimes my favorite texture though is the Musgrave texture. Let's plug that in instead. So factor, factor. We might get a more interesting effect this way. So you can see it's all knobby and wobbly there. Changing the textures. Lucanarity. Whoa, too much. So play around with these and see what you can get. Might be kind of fun. This one has multiple ways of calculating it, and you can play around with that and see what kind of effects you can get that way. Then you can combine this with other textures, and it might get kind of interesting. I like this one better. Turn down the roughness on this, so that way some areas are glossy, some areas are not glossy. Okay, so a little bit more complicated textures there. If we wanted to turn up the brightness on these guys, I could turn the strength up to, say, 20, but that might blow out our texture, so let's have it be around 5. Nope, still too much. Let's try 3. I think I'll keep it at 1, and instead change my exposure, so that way we can see more of our molecule better. Instead of cranking up the lights and everything, let's just change our exposure. And that's over here under this tab. Then we'll go to color management, and let's just increase the exposure of our scene in general. See if we can't let's use curves and bring up the dark ends right here, but still keep the high ends a little low. Too low. Good. And this is available in if you're using an older version of Blender, but if you're using a newer version of Blender, we can come down here under this panel and turn on denoising as well. And so what that will allow us to do is when we render, we won't have to turn up the samples quite as high. Okay, so let's make sure we see what the camera sees. This is what the camera sees right now, so obviously it's not ideal. So I'm going to hit Shift F and move the camera out a little bit and just try to frame this up a little bit better. Okay, and then I'm just going to scrub through there and see what the camera's going to see. I think it needs to move over to the left a little bit. There we go. Okay, I think that'll look all right. Ready to go. All right, in the next video we'll talk about how to render.